Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian president, has been at the center of one of the most complex and tragic stories of the 21st century. His rise to power, the brutal regime he built, the devastating civil war that followed, and the uncertain future of Syria are all intertwined in a web of politics, ideology, and violence. This is the untold story of Bashar al-Assad and the fall of his regime. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad inherited the presidency of Syria from his father, Hafez al-Assad, who ruled the country with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades. Bashar, who had spent much of his life studying medicine in the West, was not initially groomed for the job. His older brother Basil was the heir apparent, but after his tragic death in a car accident, Bashar was thrust into the political spotlight. At first, many in the West saw Bashar as a potential reformer. He was young, educated, and seemed more open to change than his father. Some even hoped he would steer Syria toward greater political openness. But under Bashar's rule, Syria remained highly repressive, where opposition was crushed and dissent was met with violence. His regime was built on a system of patronage where loyalty to the Assad family was paramount. The military played a central role, and security forces were notorious for their brutal tactics. However, in 2011, the Arab Spring reached Syria. The people, inspired by uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, took to the streets, demanding political freedom, economic reform, and an end to corruption. What began as peaceful protests quickly escalated into a violent conflict. The Assad regime responded with brutal force, live ammunition, torture, and mass arrests. The movement for reform soon morphed into a full-blown civil war, with rebel groups, including secular and Islamist factions, fighting back. This also became a proxy war, with international powers taking sides. Syria's once thriving cities were reduced to rubble. Over 500,000 people lost their lives, and millions were displaced, creating one of the worst refugee crises in history. Despite this devastation, Bashar al-Assad held on to power, thanks to the support of Russia and Iran. These nations provided military aid, financial support, and diplomatic backing. The Russian intervention in 2015 was a game-changer, allowing Assad to recapture key cities like Aleppo and Homs. By 2019, Assad had regained much of the territory he lost, though parts of Syria, particularly in the north and northeast, remained outside his control. While the civil war officially ended in 2020, Syria was left in ruins. The war left deep scars on the nation's psyche, with much of the population displaced and the economy shattered. Even as Assad seemed victorious, questions about Syria's future persisted. His rule was increasingly dependent on the backing of Russia and Iran, and large parts of the country remained outside his control. The war might have officially ended, but the political solution seemed impossible, and Syria remained a divided country. His legitimacy was contested internationally, with Western nations imposing sanctions, preventing any meaningful reconstruction. By the end of 2024, the situation in Syria has taken a dramatic turn. For the first time since the war began, rebel forces have made significant advances into Damascus, threatening the heart of Assad's regime. The once impenetrable capital has become a battleground. Rebel factions including moderate and Islamist groups launched coordinated offensives against key districts in the suburbs of Damascus. These advances came after months of unrest and growing opposition from local militias and insurgent groups. The push into Damascus was fueled by widespread discontent. Ordinary Syrians, exhausted by more than a decade of war, were fed up with Assad's brutal rule. Rising inflation, food shortages, and power outages created a volatile atmosphere. The regime's security apparatus weakened and rebel groups began to gain control over key checkpoints near government buildings in the capital. With these advances, Bashar al-Assad's situation has become precarious. Reports suggest that Assad has been in contact with Russian and Iranian officials, discussing potential escape routes and safe havens. Intelligence sources indicate that Assad has quietly prepared to flee if Damascus falls. His possible destinations include Russia or Iran, where he could find temporary refuge. This possibility of Assad fleeing has gained traction as defections among his inner circle increase. High-level military leaders disillusioned by the regime's failures have begun deserting Assad's forces. The loss of these key figures has added to the chaos, leaving Assad with fewer loyalists and a weakened military command. In Damascus, the situation is unraveling. Despite efforts to suppress protests, More and more civilians are openly voicing their discontent as the rebels draw closer. The capital, once a symbol of Assad's power, is now facing a humanitarian crisis. Basic services have become scarce, and the regime's security forces are stretched thin. The international community is closely watching the situation. Though Russia and Iran continue to provide military support, their commitment is increasingly uncertain. Russian military advisors are reportedly withdrawing from key areas, and Iran's resources are stretched thin by regional commitments. If these foreign powers pull back, it could mark the final blow to Assad's regime. If Bashar al-Assad does flee, the power vacuum would be filled by competing factions. While many Syrians would celebrate his departure, there is no clear leader to unify the country. Rebel groups, still divided by ideology, could plunge Syria into further chaos. A stable transition remains unclear. The fall of Damascus could mark the end of Bashar al-Assad's brutal regime and the culmination of over a decade of war. Once thought to be unbreakable, the Assad regime now faces an uncertain future. Rebels press closer, and the possibility of Assad fleeing Syria looms ever larger. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification button to never miss any story.